What kinds of sounds are social scientists interested in? By and large, the sounds of words, not their own, I might say, but the sounds of the words of interviewees, and how that then becomes textualized, and through that textualization, a mode of knowledge production. And recording technology has a very important role to play in that process. But what it means to record and what the recording technology can do besides recording and playing back for us after the event, what those words were, is a territory that's really not been explored a great deal in social science. The point is that words and the sonic environment that they are modulated to aren't just simply reducible to written concepts. Words are performative, and that they engage modes of listening, which can be approached through practical means that involve making recordings, and then playing recordings back to the people who are the subjects of these recordings. And in thinking this through, it means engaging with a territory of work that doesn't normally come within our purview. It means engaging with sound art and with radio documentary. And this is where I'm going to start with a recording by a radio documentarian who worked in the 1950s in New York, called Tony Schwartz. And all of his work is archived at the Smithsonian Folkways recording library. And he had a program that would encourage people to send their own recordings in, and also allowed him to go out onto the streets of New York and record the stuff of everyday life, ordinary speech, the sounds of the environment, mechanical noises, and produce material like this. Okay, so this kind of material engages very well with what we would know in anthropology as the ethnography of speaking, emergent from obviously social linguistics, work of Jonathan Searle, the idea of the total speech act, and mostly represented through the kinds of academic analyses that look at, for example, the meanings of silence amongst 17th century Quaker communities, in reference to Gerd Bauman's work on historical anthropology, or Keith Basso, an anthropologist who works in the Southwest in the United States, about knowing when to give up on words amongst the Apache Indians. It's about really engaging with how vocal performance is linked to affective meaning and the manipulation of rhythmic repetition, poetic virtuosity, pauses, the silences in speech, and the moral loading of conventions. Schwartz's work that we've just heard is part of the genre of radio documentary, and with a different purpose in mind engages with the affective dimensions of speech. I think it demonstrates very well Searle's point about speech acts, and, as I say, with a kind of ethnography of speaking. Perhaps the epitome of this work, and I won't have time to play it now, is Glenn Gould's Idea of the North, Glenn Gould being the composer and pianist who worked in Canada, but also, interestingly, for a short period of time for a radio station, and put together an interview with three individuals as what he called a contrapuntal tone poem, thinking about the affective qualities of voice. What all of this kind of work relies upon, particularly when it involves making recordings, is initially a kind of listening. And that listening can be made more acute and more intellectually analytical as well through the process of trying to make recordings. A journal in the 1960s caught on to this moment and would publish 78 records in the back of the journal. We'd have a 78 record in the back of the journal. This was a journal called Alcaringo, or Ethnopoetics, again published in the States by Jerome Rothenberg and Dennis Tedlock. So they'd have poetry by Gary Snyder, an analysis of Hopi folk songs, and then this 78 record slipped into the back of the disc. But it's all contingent, as I say, on listening. And this was really how I got into this kind of work in the first place, which had started with research about vision, not sound at all, in Japan, and the kinds of vision that were involved for people doing Zen practices, both in the sense of enlightenment, a kind of transcendental vision that was the ideal outcome of these very kind of rigorous and long-term practices, but also the way that people learned to approach that experience through a kind of seeing of the spaces that they were in this case, as you see here, a garden, and appreciating that space with a view to this inner vision, but also learning from textbooks which use photographs and other visual means. And taking that work into the realm of another Zen metaphor is what led me to sound, and that was the idea of these spaces as oral as well as visual. The idea that, as in the famous Zen koan, you can achieve this sort of inner experience, transcendental vision, through thinking about the sound of one hand clapping. And that kind of work as an anthropologist meant staying within environments that were full of noises that weren't really part of what rhetorically you would understand the silence to be. Silence was never actually totally silent, and gardens were where you would go to appreciate this kind of concept in Zen were actually full of sounds. And people have done some very interesting work around this idea in Japan, looking at practices, for example, where people go out annually and listen to the sound of a lotus blossom blooming. You can't hear a lotus blossom bloom, but the social effect of collectively going at night time to do this kind of activity means you engage with the environment in a very particular way. Another example of a competition, an award in Tokyo, which asked residents to nominate their favourite silent place, and then they would write a poem to explain, or write a piece at least, but certainly most people wrote poems to explain why this was their favourite silent place. And of course, again, these places were never actually silent. Silence existed in the relationality of noises, one to another. Which brings us into the material aspects of the social sphere that we can apprehend through working in this kind of way that involves deep listening. This is a comment by Stephen Connor, who's been very involved in thinking through ideas about sound and the sound of voice as well. He has a very useful website with a lot of material that you can download. And it brings me to an instance indeed in Japan where I met Bill Fontana, the internationally famous sound artist, who was doing a piece around temple bells in Kyoto, Buddhist temple bells, placing contact microphones on the bells over long periods, up to 12 hours, and making these long recordings because they picked up the resonances of the bells, as they did also with the people who were passing by. And the Zen priests there, interestingly, couldn't get a grip on the idea that the bells were still ringing even when they weren't actually ringing. So this was kind of West Coast California meets Zen in Japan, and out-Zens the Zen that was there in the first place. But this kind of engaged listening really has its derivation in two movements: sound studies and soundscape studies. Sound studies can be traced to the work Noise by the Marxist historian Jacques Attali. And in that work, he drew attention to the historically constructed orality of the everyday world and to acts of listening, acts of audition, as being of political consequence. In that sense, all music or any organized patterns of sounds was a tool for the creation or the consolidation of a community. Soundscape, the other concept and movement from which this kind of engaged listening derives, is a term coined by the Canadian composer and theorist Murray Schafer, and it's used to identify the sonic specificity of a place as it would be heard by people who live in that space. Not as perhaps you or I would hear it, where our ears would automatically edit out certain things. He wrote about soundscape at a time when there was a kind of romantic and documentary impulse to record the vanishing or disappearing sounds of everyday life, that it was supposed that urbanization and modernity in general was kind of grinding out. But there's a great many different outcomes of the work of this concept in different works. And then in sound art, we can also find a kind of engagement with the sonic world through recording, which makes us realize what's possible to do when you set up a microphone and you begin to think about making a recording that can be a kind of analysis. And in this sense, there are two movements, one of which has approached sound as an event in the world, something that needs to be understood in context, as something constituted socially. You can think of the work of John Cage, his work 433, all about a period of duration of silence in a concert hall. It's very much about how the sound exists as a consequence of the particular kind of socialized environment that listening takes place within. And then the work of the electroacoustic movement led by Pierre Schaeffer in Paris, that was about sound as an object and entering into a psychoacoustic universe of sound by taking it away from what we would understand about it through its origins, removing it from the context in which it would be heard originally, and working with it as a tool to evoke emotion. And that's also about how sound designers work in film. Where these two approaches can cross over, sound art and documentary, is in evidence in the next recording I'm going to play by an artist at the London College of the Arts, John Wynne, who did a residency at Wakefield Heart Hospital in London, thinking through about how the noises of machines constitute an element of the sense of being a patient in a hospital, particularly heart machines, where there's a literal direct connection with your physical condition. And this is his work, just briefly.
Well, I guess as with whatever environment you become familiar with, you gradually lose the acute sensations that you first get. I mean, you can be really overwhelmed with the noises, especially if you have a room in the centre of the ward, and there are loud alarm bells that clang and ring frequently, very loud, raucous buzzers for people requiring nurses coming to their rooms. Gradually that fades and you can almost not notice it. I spent the first week trying to turn the bells into flocks of Greek sheep and goats and imagine them up mountainsides, but it wasn't really very successful. And I ended up with great sympathy for Mohammed, I think, who hated bells, and that's why he has towers of people with imams calling off them. The bells were out of favour. I can see why.
Working with this kind of material in a responsible and ethically responsible fashion means giving the subjects of the material the opportunity to hear it back, and playing the material back as being the primary means for the way that anthropologists do their work, so that it's not only about making it, but then about the responses that you engender from the subjects in taking it back to them. Obviously giving them the opportunity to say otherwise if it's material that you don't want to have published, but also as a way of generating data. And a problem with this has tended to be that the work that's represented in academic journals is about the words of people responding to the material, but never represented so well by the material in and of itself. And that approach to actually having the material in and of itself do the work of the analysis, to helping us understand how sound can constitute a sense of place and of social relations in place, has been really led by only one person, an anthropologist called Stephen Feld, who began his work in the rainforests of Papua New Guinea. He now works very, very broadly. And in this particular kind of environment, sounds were much more closely connected to their origins, and therefore part of a way in which people interacted, which could be made clear through with each other, which could be made clear through recordings. What he was trying to get away from was the idea that if the sound in itself is not complex in its material aspects, then social meaning was essentially shallow. And in listening to the sounds of the rainforest and the bird song in the rainforest, he came to an appreciation that the sounds of speech and song, and indeed the whole sense of place of the community, was orientated around sound and not vision, given particularly that you can't really know where you are in a rainforest by what you see, because it all looks fairly similar. But you can know where you are, and know where you are is meaningful in terms of the history of the community that you're part of and events that happened in that space through sound. And the way that sound reverberates, particularly within the geography of the rainforest, is something that becomes appreciable to people who live in these spaces over time. Alfred Gell, another anthropologist, went as far as to talk about this in terms of acoustic and visual cultures, and described going out of the forest for the first time with people who saw the sea and the horizon, and whose sort of perception of the world was radically changed, because it had hitherto been in these very close confines, a part of this very dense sound world. So Steve Feld's work has been about using recordings in ways that actually make this appreciable when you hear it, alongside what he's written. So all of his work has a recording alongside the text. And he coined a term to describe this called acoustemology, meaning the particular way of knowing that is appreciable through sound, but involves the whole body, not just the ears. He's since gone on to work on a number of different projects, including one here at Manchester a couple of years ago, where we recreated through a sound and visual art piece the environment of the beaches in Ghana where the slave trade took place from. This was a piece called Castaways, and he recorded the sounds of the Atlantic Ocean on a beach, together with a visual artist who'd done collage compositions from detritus washed up on the beach. And in making recordings that can do this sort of work, the second point, beyond listening as a prelude to the recording, was a paradigm of what he called layering, of building up different tracks that would bring you into a world that had to be deep in order for you to have this sonic journey of discovery. It's a way of making recordings that involves thinking about what is there in any space in the background as an atmosphere, and what is there up close. It is sometimes called the species or featured sound. It might be the sound of a voice. And the background to these kinds of technologized ways of thinking has come under a lot of criticism through sound studies, which have looked at the ways that particular modes of hearing are built into technologies, like, for example, MP3 technology. There's a mode of the human listener that is literally built into the technology. And the critique that comes from that into the work of people like Stephen Feld is that what we hear partly is a function of that technology. We're listening to the model of human hearing built into the technology as much as we are listening to the Kaluli people in the Papua New Guinea rainforest listening to birdsong. Steve Feld's argument is that unless we artificially manipulate and understand what the technology is capable of doing, we can't, because you and our ears would edit out what's meaningful about those sounds. We can't enter into that world without the help of technology. And although it's been accused of what's called sonic fetishism, his secondary argument is that it's about what you do with the recording as something that you can take back to people. And he works in a way that's very collaborative, what's called dialogic editing, listening to the environment together with people that you then make the recording with, adjusting literally the dials on the recording device together with people in the space that you want to investigate. Finally, to talk about my own work, I've been interested in a totally different kind of environment, one that is contemporary to Okinawa and thoroughly militarized. These are US air bases where the sounds of everyday life are constituted in large part by the flight paths of US military jets. This being the largest base in East Asia, the one that we see featured here, which is a picture of Kadena Air Base. And planes have flown here since the Second World War, when the Americans fought over the island and replaced the Japanese air base with this air base. And in so doing, appropriated the land of the local community, and most importantly, the grave sites that they can now no longer visit, and where relatives who died during the war, whose spirits would otherwise return to those grave sites annually, are, as it were, restless and form part of a very disturbed world that people literally hear into when the jets pass overhead without warning into the midst of all of the stuff of their everyday lives. So the work I've been involved in is a collaboration with acoustic scientists who had created a large amount of statistical data from this community who had suffered the ill effects of of noise over a 25, 30-year period. That's the period he'd done the study. And he could show instances of tinnitus, heart disease, birth defects in children, behavioural problems. But also, of course, this cultural element, which would be the resonance of the bombing of the war that was reproduced in veterans who would hear these sounds in very deeply traumatic ways. And this is a recording of what I mean. So one of the things that was apparent in making these recordings is the way that sounds in this particular space, which happens to be actually the space of the invasion when the US troops first landed. It was precisely on this beach space. And the sound of these particular jets in this particular space hangs in the air in a way that isn't there in the data of the work that was done by these acoustic scientists working for the local government in order that local people could bring proceedings against the American military for compensation for these sound effects. It brought out, in listening together with people to these recordings, all kinds of memories of the war and of the various different kinds of traumas that they had experienced subsequently, different pathologies of the body, but also socially in their own lives, with family breakdowns, as children would have to be educated away from the home as partnerships broke up because of the difficulty of living in these kinds of surroundings. The sound levels here are about 120 decibels. So we're not talking about something that is within the realm of what we would normally know from living in the vicinity of an airport. And indeed, over 70 decibels is known to be harmful to human hearing. But it's not just the sheer volume, as I say, it's the particular kind of sonic rush where these airplanes, these aircraft, emerge initially as if they are the sound of a wave being sucked up in this beach space. So it's very hard to know when they're going to come. And of course there's no schedule that the US military are going to produce so that people will know when these jets are going to come. So I've been making recordings in different locations that are meaningful because of the geography of the space where these events happened during the war, or because of the because of their spiritual significance. Spaces within the community where particular sacred rituals would happen, or because the community centre, for example, was located, and the measuring device that the community used to record sounds is featured there. But it's only in using the work collaboratively with people by playing it back that it can begin to achieve the kind of relevance that makes it possible to listen to it in ways that bring us into the social world of the people who are the subjects of listening. Because, of course, these same sounds exist for the US military on the base as, and I quote, a sound of freedom. And this is a concept that's used as part of an official military strategy to as a form of sonic warfare in arenas like Afghanistan and Iraq, low-flying, high-speed missions. It's also used by the Israelis in Gaza to keep everybody awake. Making recordings like this then also can't be assumed to index precisely, because of the contingencies of the technology, the way that it's recorded, what the sound actually is in that space and how it would be heard by different people. So for me, they exist really as part of a series of recordings where what is meaningful in the sounds that we've just heard is there because of the absence of other sounds that would otherwise replace them, or that exists as in the consciousness of the people that hear them. So thinking that through meant making recordings with people who had experienced the war, lived in the community since that time, and would take me on journeys that they made for themselves every week, back to the rainforests in the north of Okinawa, where they hid out from the American military, on hiking trips. They go every week on these hiking trips. And one of the sounds that was distinctive to that environment, that they go back to, as I say, regularly, that resonates with this experience from the war, is the sound of a flightless rail that is unique to Okinawa and endangered by the snakes that the American military brought in, the mongoose that the American military brought in to keep down the snake population. So this sound, in other words, exists as a kind of phantom sound in the consciousness of people who hear these aircraft sounds, and can be there on as part of a series of recordings that work across each other rather than trying to index particular things by themselves. So this is where I'll finish with the sound of the Yambaru Quina, the flightless rail. So that shrill sound there is the sound of the rail. So of course, by themselves, such sounds are, index something that quite precise to the environment, but making a series of recordings that cross over between and are accompanied by text and by photographs as well, potentially, can lead us to a different kinds of understanding of the sound worlds of these spaces, these kinds of spaces, albeit very intense spaces in this case. So to conclude, thinking methodologically, I've reduced to 3 simple concepts this way of working, which involves listening, a certain kind of listening that can be led by engaging with work that we wouldn't normally consider part of social scientific inquiry, sound art, radio, documentary. It involves recording, which means learning how to use technology, and that is difficult because it can take time to appreciate what technology can do and what you need it to do. And then playing back, working both responsibly but also with a view to the kinds of material that can be generated by creating quite a performative sort of situation where you listen collaboratively with the people who are the subjects of this work. Working in this way can then address questions about the use of language in everyday life, the relationship between perceptions of the environment and social and political formations, and that references the work I've just talked about in Okinawa, with protest groups that are organised around the sonic world of these military aircraft. It can address the relationship between technology and the self, something that Stephen Connor has written a great deal about, and which involves sound studies. And it can also address questions about the bodily basis of hearing, that we hear through our bodies and not merely through our auditory mechanisms. And that concludes the talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you.